So my name is Lindsay Simon. I am I'm an engineer at Quip. But of course, everything I show you today, it's actually all real. So the forward-looking statement still says, don't buy anything based on stuff I show you that isn't real. Still applies. But I'm an engineer at Quip. I've been there 2 years. I helped work on the development of the Live Apps platform, which is what I'm going to talk about today. In particular, I'm going to talk about how to connect it to Salesforce data, because that seems relevant for the audience and for you. So what we'll learn, we're going to learn how to create a live app, just basically, then connect it to Salesforce data. We're going to connect to the new Salesforce UI API, and we're going to talk about how live apps can supercharge workflows. So for starters, in the agenda, I'm going to talk about what is Quip, and then live apps, and then 2 pretty in-depth demos with code and walkthroughs. And this is the kind of session where, we have 40 minutes, so if you have a question, just put your hand up or yell or jump on the mic. We don't have to wait till the end. I think it'll be much more enjoyable if you have a question to bring it up during the talk. But how many of you do use or know what Quip is? All right, well, that's good. That'll make the beginning of what is Quip a little redundant, but you get to see some lovely marketing slides that we've put together. So the premise of Quip and why it was started was to sort of defeat the culture of stagnation. How many of you have been on an email chain with version 1, version 2, version 3 of an attachment, version 4, nobody replies? Does this sound familiar? Yeah, this is, I was a consultant for years and even worked at Google for a while, and this was how work got done a lot of the times, and it's pretty irritating. And so Quip was really built to try to come up with a more modern approach to how you should do work. And it was done in the context of mobile apps, things that we were used to using socially, SMS, notifications, Facebook, tools that we use with our friends, and then we'd go to work and have these kludgy, sort of lame tools. And so Quip was built to try to make work enjoyable, fun, and live. So Quip is Salesforce's productivity platform. And what does that look like? In Quip, what we call that is that it creates a culture of action within your company. Particularly, it starts with empowerment. You can share things. You don't have to go into a complicated bucket of access control. Quip is meant to make everything shareable and visual around who you're sharing with. Collaboration is built in right along next to a canvas. It's a chat communication. It also shows you diffs as people make edits in Quip documents, and it allows you to quickly send notifications to other people. There's connection. This is where you can connect to third-party data sources, your own, or other ones your company uses. This is really what we're going to talk about today. And then innovation being the fact that Quip is mobile first. When I close my laptop, I'm not stuck with a lousy experience of Quip. Notifications are seamless. I can go and interact with all of my content. It's not a disadvantage to not be without my laptop. And in fact, this is going to be great because Arnab's going to do some demos from his phone in the audience in my live app, and he didn't even need to bring a laptop. We're not even nervous. So what does the platform look like? The premise for Quip as a platform is that it starts down, it has clients on mobile, desktop, and web. Then you get into access controls that IT admins and admins care about. Are any of you admins of Salesforce? Okay, so this is the kind of thing you'd want to control how your site or your company uses Quip. And then down at another layer, this is where we have a set of customization tools. Quip has APIs for you to engage with the document and with data in Quip. One thing to note that's interesting here is that Quip has APIs, and they're REST-based APIs, but Quip isn't API-driven. It's WebSocket-driven. When we develop for Quip, we're not often developing with the APIs that you'll use to interact with Quip. Sometimes we are when we build live apps, but not always. So you'll find that there's a lot of control here and things that should be familiar to you as a Salesforce developer as well. So what are live apps? And that's what we're here to talk about. Live apps is Quip's developer platform. And the goal is to extend Quip. The premise is we can't develop everything you and your company needs and solve every workflow issue that you might have. We want to make it possible for you as a developer or you as a person empowered to hire people to develop in your site to get Quip to do things with your own custom data, as well as then to interact with other third-party tools. Like you might use Salesforce, Box, Dropbox, Jira, or Slack. Quip didn't build all these tools. These companies actually build them and maintain them. It would be a gargantuan engineering task for Quip to try to maintain all of these integrations. And so we don't. We let them maintain them. And we'll let you build and maintain your own collaborations. The last part here about being offline first, this is really important for the fact that Quip is mobile. When you build a live app, it's too easy to make it offline. And that's important because it's mobile first and you're out and you might lose connectivity, it's really important you don't lose data and you don't lose the ability to synchronize when you do get online. So this is an example of a live app. This is Quip's built Salesforce record. This is a view of an account object in Salesforce. And immediately what you do is you log in with OAuth as a user, it fetches the data, and it caches it. It caches it in Quip's RootRecord. And this is something we'll talk about later, but I want to reference it now because if you go offline and you reload this in your app or on your phone, it still has all the data visible to you. You don't suddenly see question marks or nothing where there should be data. And this is great if you are on the go or you're a salesperson. That's really who this is targeted for. It does bidirectional updates using Salesforce's APIs. So the developer workflow. How many of you are developers? Okay, great. This is a really quick walkthrough of sort of the steps you would take. I'm going to walk through actually doing these things in this presentation, but I want to give you a sense of what's involved when you do start to develop a live app. So you'll start by going to Quip's developer console at quip.com/dev/console. There you see a button that says create a live app. You create a live app and it's just basically a shell of a tool in the dev console. You get, on your command line, you'll run npm install create Quip app. Create Quip app is a tool, is a npm script, much like create React app. Are any of you familiar with create React app? Okay, create React app is a scaffolding tool just to set up a directory to make it really easy to build a React application. We modeled create Quip app very much on create React app so that it would be easy and familiar to you to get started. So you make your own directory, my app. You paste the app ID that you got from the dev console into a text file called the manifest. Then you run a script, npm run build. This just packages up a zip file, which we call an ELE. It's a bundle that you can then upload to the dev console. You upload to the dev console, you refresh your document, and you can now insert your live app by name into the document. From there, you're going to run back on your command line a command npm run start. This runs a local Webpack server. You'll go into the menu, use local resources, and now you can develop just as you would locally using a local server to develop a React app. Should be very familiar. From there, when you're satisfied, you run another script, you upload the ELE bundle, and you're done. You can deploy to your entire site, like your company. You could deploy to the App Exchange so that other companies could then install your live app, or you could petition Quip, and maybe if it's so amazing, we'll install it for everybody who uses Quip. So let me know if you build one like that, and I'd love to get it installed. So now we're going to talk about connecting to Salesforce data. Have any of you built a live app, by the way? Okay, cool. Great. This is most of what I'm going to talk about in this demo. There's code on GitHub here at the Quip apps repository. That's Quip's open source repository for example code, as well as some of our tools. In fact, the Create Quip app tool is there in this Quip apps repository. But here, this last one, Salesforce Connected OAuth 2, all of the code I'll show you, you could go look at later and download and try this yourself. But we'll look at it. Essentially, you start with Salesforce, like you would for any development where you need to do OAuth, and you make a connected app. So when you make a connected app, one thing you have to do is specify the kind of scopes you want to get access to, so you can control this to whatever kind of app you want to build. You might just want web APIs, or you might want the full scope for full access to Salesforce data, meaning you could write back and things like that, or user data. So in here, the most important part is there's a consumer key and a consumer secret. Here's the key, and here's the secret, which you click to reveal. These are things that you then cut and paste. Now, I mentioned that you go to the Quip dev console when you create a live app. And so here, you can see this is the Quip OAuth 2 configuration. In the dev console, among the things you have in this left-hand menu here, one of them is auth. This is how you configure the ability for your app to make and establish an OAuth connection to a third-party data source. So in here, you give it a name. That's important because we'll use that when we write code. Beyond that, you give it a URL where authorization happens. This is pretty standard in every OAuth 2 implementation. Salesforce uses like /services/OAuth2/authorize. Here, you'll notice I've connected to test.salesforce.com because I want to talk to a sandbox. From there, then you have a token URL. This redirect URL is magic. We generate it for you to cut and paste back into this part of the callback URL in your connected app. This is so that when you make an OAuth request, it needs to ultimately redirect somewhere, and so you redirect back to Quip at the end of the flow, and then Quip closes that flow, captures the access token, and you're good to go. Like I said, you need the client ID and client secret. Those are the most important pieces here, and you cut and paste them into this auth config. You set the scope for the tokens that you want to obtain, and here I always ask usually for refresh token and API. Refresh token makes it so that in my code, I don't have to have the user manually authenticate after every time their authentication expires. And in Salesforce, that's quite often about 24 hours. Sometimes it's 12 hours. And so you need the ability to refresh the token. This is a security feature in OAuth. And so now this can be done in code. So you can write code to automatically refresh the tokens for some period. And there, next you need to set up the proxy API domains. And I'll talk about what that's for. But Quip runs a service on quip.com that enables you and your live app to connect to Quip and then connect out to third-party data. This is useful because some of these third-party data sources don't have cores set up, or you may not be able to get cores set up for your live app, but now you can just proxy through a server. Cores is a tool where it's an AJAX command like blocker so that sites don't have to handle requests from random JavaScript apps. So what does this look like? I'm going to show you this demo here in a second, but essentially, let's go ahead and do it. Let me break out of my thing here. I wanted to get to code or something like that as fast as possible, and instead I've talked too much. Okay, I'm going to log out so that we can start by, this is the flow. This is just I've run the build of the repository I mentioned earlier that's on GitHub. That's the open source version of this just simple connected live app. And I've inserted it into my document. And so now I'm going to log in. This pops up the OAuth window. I've already logged in as this user before, so I can click here. We establish the OAuth connection, and now my live app knows I'm logged in and presents a user interface that I've written. And I'll show you what that user interface looks like as well. But among the really simple things you can do is you might want to test an endpoint on Salesforce. So you can type in any endpoint you want here. In this case, this is just the really simple services data endpoint. This tells you all of the versions available for the API. And importantly, you'll see, Summer 19. This is the one we're all here for, right? So we're going to leverage some tools from the Summer 19 release. And specifically, that's version 46. We're going to talk about the list UI as we go into a much more extensive demo. But I want to talk about even just this interaction, because doing a login correctly and establishing a way to make a request is fundamental to making a live app that connects to your data sources. Salesforce is just a good example there, because I think you'd want to write one connected to Salesforce. So let's show you some of the code for this. This is our OAuth 2 app. It's really basic. Like I said, a Quip live app looks very much like a simple React app that you should be familiar with if you run create React app in a directory. From there, you get, you get a file, the root.jsx file. All this does is this shows you the 1 bit of code you need to instantiate a Quip live app. We connect it to a DOM node that Quip passes in the initialize function. This happens every time the page loads, essentially. And this will render your app code into the iframe that is the Quip live app. From there, the code for the simple OAuth app, it does a couple things. It quickly tests if we're logged in, and then sets that bit on the state right away, and then sets loading of login to false, because probably we're not going to start by loading it. And we need to make a couple of functions. We need to make a login, we need to make a logout, and then we have this sort of handler in the event of logging in or logging out. So here, we're going to use state in our really simple app to just set whether or not we are logged in. You would recognize this function here, the getAuth function. That function is just running the Quip apps auth. This maps to the auth config I showed you where you pasted in the client ID and client secret, and this gives you a reference to a tool in the Live app to make requests to third-party servers or to log in. And so that's all we need to do. We need to get a reference to our auth config, and then we want to log in. This prompt login part is useful for Salesforce. It's a parameter that prevents login from getting redirected in a peculiar way. But eventually, you'll log in. Then you want to handle that login, and finally, you would set the state that you're loading to false. And logout looks really similar. So when you log out, this calls ROAuth2 config again, calls logout across all your instances of this Live app, and then it updates it. And all we do in the state function is to get, we call a method isLoggedIn that Quip gives you to check whether or not your auth config is logged in or not. Once you're logged into one instance of a Live app, you're logged into subsequent instances of that Live app. This is important because it gives you a kind of persistent storage about the state of login. If you have an app that lives in multiple Quip documents, this is great because your user only has to log in once, and now they have that app as a feature anywhere. They don't have to log in every time they use it. So at the end, the render function is pretty straightforward. We look at whether or not we're logged in the state. From there, we either call login or logout with this button. We change the text either to login or logout. We always render that button at the top. And then once we're logged in, we render this API test component. API test is sort of the meat of what you saw with the input box and the submit button. And really what I want to talk about there is the onSubmit handler when you click the button, because that's really the sort of meat and potatoes of making a request to a third-party site. When you click the onSubmit button here, we grab what's called the token response. Quip provides storage for this out of the box for you. So once you get an auth reference, if the user's logged in, then you can call this function getTokenResponse. This is an object representation of the response from the OAuth2 server. And in that, from Salesforce, you get this magic property, the instance URL. This tells you what instance of Salesforce you're logged into. So now you can craft URLs to talk to Salesforce endpoints by saying, okay, start with the instance URL, and here we're just going to append the text string of the endpoint that you type in. So you can now use this to try any endpoint on Salesforce's services. From there, we set state. We mention that we're going to load some URL just to make the UI look nice. Then we get a reference to the auth config. And again, now we're going to call request. Request here is lovely because request will now proxy through Quip, send the bearer token that we got in the token response along in the headers without having to use cores through our server. Now you can make requests to Salesforce with auth already done. Normally, you would have to say fetch in JavaScript, include the bearer token manually, and then make sure you had cores set up. This is really nice just in case you don't have that already working. From there, after you've made a request, you get the response object. You notice I tend to console debug all the responses just so that I can see what's happening. One thing that I encounter when hitting Salesforce endpoints is that when they don't work, often what happens is the response isn't in JSON format. It's in XML, or it's in another sort of more peculiar format. But you always can look at this OK bit from Salesforce's endpoints and see, oh, did things work? And if they didn't, you can drop an error. You could handle this much more gracefully than I am in this demo. But after that, you can stringify. In this case, I'm stringifying the JSON response and trying to make it pretty so that I can render it back into this text area. So one of the other endpoints that I want to hit and that we're going to talk about as we build stuff, I've done it before, I probably got rid of it, is I want to hit the list UI endpoint, because that's one of the new endpoints that Salesforce has developed in summer 19, and it's what we're going to use as the foundation for the much more complicated app we're going to walk through going forward. So I'm going to come back to this in a minute or so and look through it more. But let me go back to my slide, play here. And I pasted in code in case I couldn't get my own laptop to work, but I'm going to skip it now because we've gone over it. But that is here in case you want to get the copy of this slide deck later and go look through it. So now we're going to talk about a much more complicated example. Here we're going to build what we call a collaborative pricing proposal. This demo, we're going to actually use one of Salesforce's new endpoints, the List UI endpoint. And we're going to build a live app that shows a list of items in Salesforce and is constantly connected to that list. Again, this code is also in our open source repository, and you can go browse it, copy it, install it on your own Quip site, edit it, and make something useful. So in this demo, what are we going to cover? We're going to talk about the setup so that you have some context around what we're going to try to build and why. We're going to use Salesforce's new UI API List UI endpoint. We're going to render the results and this entire live app using the React Lightning design system that Salesforce maintains and makes pretty easy to use inside of Quip Live Apps, and I'll talk about how to set that up and keep that working. And beyond that, I'm going to talk about live app storage and best practices there, particularly using a higher order component so that you can use your RootRecord in Quip kind of like a Redux store. Or is anyone familiar with Redux? Redux is basically just a place to store an object of data that your app has access to in React, and it can use all the properties as props on React components. It's a nice way to simplify the data and view layers in a React app. There, we'll also talk about data models in Quip and how you can take advantage of the primitives that Quip gives you for live apps, and also how to enable commenting. And then we'll talk about dynamic menus. But let's set this story up. So have you seen other demos around e-bikes at the conference so far? I'm curious. Okay, good. At least some of you have. When we started Trailhead DX planning, one of the things I was asked to do is try to build a demo that uses the e-bikes data. And I thought, okay, cool. I hope people have seen some stuff like this before. But we have an opportunity to sell $15 million worth of e-bikes to a chain store called Wheelworks. And so we have an opportunity in Salesforce for this. But what we actually want to do is we want to negotiate with the customer. We want to know which bikes they want to buy, and we want to give them the opportunity to communicate with us around pricing and other sorts of information, things they might care about, and collaborate with us on making this opportunity come to life. Because nothing matters if we don't close the deal. And we want to close this deal. So we're going to use the List UI to get a copy of all the inventory here and build a collaborative pricing proposal. This is a supercharged workflow that you can do with Quip Live Apps. I mentioned we'd get into supercharging in the beginning, but what do you want to do here? You really want to maximize revenue and pricing and get all the information in one place so that we can work with our sales team and we can work with a customer, but talk about Salesforce data in a really collaborative, modern way. And here we want to, put this on our phone. We want to get the salesperson in the field able to show all the inventory there. And if you've ever, logged into, 5 tools and tried to do this, it's pretty hard. So we're going to try to make it easier. The demo that we're going to do is we're going to create a Quip doc with 2 live apps in it. One is the opportunity. We want to keep the information about the customer just visible on here. We also then want to put a copy of a list of all the bikes. And we want to control that list in Salesforce, but we want to render it in Quip. So the goal is, again, that we're going to share this doc with the customer Wheelworks here, and then also our internal deal team to make a really lightning-fast communication mechanism. So the UI API is really the guts of what we're going to use to build this, and it looks like this. This is the response of a product list, and you can see it contains a collection of things like information about the list as well as the records. I think it's probably as good a time as any for me to show you the demo of what we're going to build and then talk about it. It's guts, because that's the fun part. But the demo is here. This is our e-bikes test live app demo, but this is really our collaborative pricing proposal. I reckon a salesperson would probably put some graphics on here and sort of fancy it up, but I wanted to keep it simple to work on it with you and talk about it. So here, this is the opportunity. This is directly connected to Salesforce, and if the data changed in Salesforce, it would change here. Similarly, this is the product list in Salesforce. This is the list of all the bikes. You can see there's a picture of the bike, there's the price of the bike, there's a little comment button here so that the customer and I could engage in some kind of commenting. Like, let's say I wanted to say, you know, hey, Wheelworks, oh, look, there's Arnab commenting right on the same one, instant real life stuff. And I didn't have to build this into my app. Quip provides commenting for free because Quip is a collaboration tool, and that is our bread and butter. So now I'm going to say, never mind Wheelworks, I'm going to say, hey, Arnab, Quip is, oh, this is amazing. Images, this comment box takes all sorts of kinds of attachments, notifications. If I were on my phone, I would have received a notification because Arnab pinged me here. And in fact, if I had a camera, I could show you that I did. But here, this is a way, again, imagine if Arnab is my customer, he might want a deal, and I'd say, no deal for you. Because we want to keep all the money, right? But anyway, no, we want to close the deal. And so we would negotiate about the price of the Dynamo X1 in this place. And so this is a pretty unique feature that isn't just, you wouldn't want to give your customers access to Salesforce to have a commenting stream there, but giving them access to a Quip doc is really easy. And all you can share just by their domain. You can share their email address, and they could come in and just get access to this one document in Quip. So now you've pulled the data out, made it collaborative, and not given them access to the ability to read and write data into Salesforce or something kind of scary. So how did we do this? So let's go look at this product list over in Salesforce. Have any of you built a product list in Salesforce before, or just a, yeah? Okay, so what's cool about this is, this is a nice table. It's got some information, but you can control like, oh, okay, I actually want to, let's say I want to include the fork information because the customer really cares about the fork. And I go and I configure this list, and I've, updated it now. Oh, right, fork doesn't have any data, sorry. It's not fork, it's level. We'll put that a bunch of fields here, and motor. Because what's interesting, do any of them? Yeah, level has data. So what's interesting there is when I go back to my demo, you can see that it just updated, right? Because I have my live app constantly polling Salesforce and looking at the list UI API's results and seeing if anything changed. And in particular, this is going to be a little hard to see, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. We can go find, every 5 seconds, this live app is polling and looking at the list view data. And it's looking at this field eTag. This is basically like a caching key. And if the eTag ever changes between the last time I stored the data and another time, I know I want to store the new results and actually update my app. So now this thing is really synced to Salesforce. So it's just a view into Salesforce again. And I think that's really the most powerful thing about this. I'm going to remove those fields because they're kind of too complicated, and I don't think the customer really cares. I'll go back and see that, sure enough, we got new list view data, and so we updated it right here. You can see the eTag value in this result. Is it this one? Well, it's one of these. In one of these, it's different, and so we updated. And so that's kind of the power here of the live app. You don't have to build a live app that's constantly syncing either. Salesforce Record up here isn't constantly syncing. You have to manually sync, and that's a feature. That's how we built it that way, because we didn't want it to constantly sync. We thought sometimes you put data into a document and you want it to be like the thing you remembered putting into the document. But what's important here is you as a developer, or you as a company, you have control of how this is done. You can build it any way you want to. So this is based on using the UI API again. So one of the things I want to do is I want to go back to the really simple OAuth config here and show you what this looks like. So we're going to take, this is V46. We want the list UI, and then I need the record ID for this to work. So let me go get that. I have it sitting here in code. Okay. So here we're going to make a request to get the list UI endpoint. And I showed you an example of what this looks like, but you can see this gives you all the information you would need to generically build a table from data in Salesforce with a great deal of metadata. You can see here's the fields that we had in that list, the name, the material, and this is a custom object, MSRP. These are custom fields. But you can see, oh, you got the label. And that's, of course, what I'm using here in the label, and this is the header for these columns. And I can iterate through this display columns bit to write out the headers and pass this directly into a component library, which is what we're going to do. But you can see now we've got quite a lot of information here in addition to the E tag, but you can control column widths. You could make this thing extremely dynamic, control it entirely in Salesforce, and always get the desired UI over in Quip if you wanted to. But then what really matters here is the list of records. You can paginate through these records using, they return the bits you'd need to paginate. In my case, we didn't paginate because that would be a whole other demo, how to paginate in React and in, with Salesforce data, but we didn't do that. So, but you can see here's the values for all of the data. So going back now, let's talk about the Lightning design system in React, because we need a way to, you'll notice that like in the secondary demo, that table looks really nice, right? And I didn't have to write that code. How did I do it? I used Salesforce's Lightning design system. So Salesforce has a number of developers that maintain an implementation of the Lightning design system in React. And this is great because it makes building complicated UIs really easy. It also makes it really easy to take things like the list UI endpoint and just feed it into this component library. They weren't developed alongside one another exactly, but they certainly will start to converge over time, I believe. So there's an example. This is showing you all of these, the React Lightning design system rendered inside of a Quip document there. We have a demo of that you can look at. But here's ultimately what it looks like. You call the card component, and inside of the card you have a data table, right? And this is a list of items is directly returned by the list UI, the list of columns, and a way to handle row change events, things like that. The items, we just do a simple map to turn the response from the list view UI into an object that the data table cares about. The columns, you'll notice that I had some really interesting columns in my data table that didn't look normal. One of them is clickable. That's the name. I wanted to make the name clickable. MSRP, this is where I wanted to insert comments. And this is what we're going to talk about going forward. And then, of course, I didn't want to render the string of the image URL. I actually wanted to render an image. So to do that, you have to bounce out to custom implementations of the DataTablecell. And they're pretty straightforward, but I'm going to show you what they look like. Here, this is what commenting, this is all the code you need to make a cell that's commentable using Quip's commenting code. So you go in, and there's really just a few bits here that matter. In particular, you need to set a DOM node as a reference for a commentable cell, and we do that just using React's ref implementation. And then you insert a Quip apps UI comment trigger, and we tie it to a record in storage, and from there now you just have commenting out of the box. And I'll show you how to actually make the storage part work so that this is easy to connect. But again, I assume you all could spend 5 minutes and get this, and then now you have the power of commenting in any app you want to build, and it's awesome for that. This is just a clickable one. You wanted to open a link. In my case, I want to open out and bounce back into Salesforce. From there, I just take an on-click handler. I get the ID and call Quip apps open link. That's what here is like, oh, if I want to provide a link to the actual product, I clicked the name field, and it opened here in Salesforce in a new tab. What's that? Oh, somehow my daughter's on the screen. She's amazing though, right? Hand for my daughter. All right. All right. Cool. Well, yeah, you believe me, I'm sure. The image DataTableCell is just a way, again, we're just going to use an image tag in the DOM and reference a source to be the property. There, that's that string you saw in the data table over in Salesforce, and now we just render an image. One important thing to note here is that Quip Live Apps, I think I mentioned this, but I glossed over it. They run in an iframe. And in order to have security in that iframe, we use what's called the CSP. CSP is a way of blocking access to a collection of domains or anything. And in order to get access, you need to whitelist things. So in order for the image URL to actually work, we have to whitelist the URL. So that doesn't work. But anyway, in order to make that work, you would have to whitelist the domain where the image source is. And in my case, I whitelisted an AWS domain, and then image is rendered just fine. So now I want to talk about storage. Because storage of Quip Live Apps data is, again, this is an important part of the Live Apps ecosystem, and it's something that should be new to you, and this is where you can get a lot of power out of Live Apps. And so I wanted to talk about how the root record, you should use the root record kind of like a Redux store in a React app, or you can also think of this as React's context API. It's just a way to say, hey, for all the componentry, all the components on my site, I want them to use a global store of data, just an object, for instance. And again, that's in the model view controller lingo, this would be the model. And so Quip gives you a model, the root record. It's stored in a local database on our phones. It's stored in, and on the apps we use a SQLite implementation. We encrypt some of that, so we keep it safe. But you get access to it with a really basic API that looks just like writing to local storage. And here, every Live app has one instance of the root record, and what we do here is we make a wrapped component for our entire app. We use this little file called the connect record, and we basically, before we render our app, we get all of the data in the root record, and we pass it in as props. We also here, this is showing you another way to pass in the logout and login functions in a really generic way to your first component to be able to call into the auth config. But now we have all of the data stored in Quip as well as any state about login passed in. When we do this, you want to start by thinking about the data model. The data model for the list UI has a few things we care about. We care about the record ID. That's the reference to the product list itself over in Salesforce. We also have a list of records, all the products themselves. We want to cache everything we get from Salesforce in Quip's root record so that if, again, we go offline, we don't lose access to this data. Selection, this is a bit where we have the checkbox in the component. This is where the customer would say, hey, I want this bike. And they can click a checkbox, and we can store that and keep it again in storage in the root record. And lastly, we store the entire response from Salesforce as list view data. And you can see, you put in the type of primitive you want here. And so you use a string for the record ID. That should be obvious. The list view data is just an object. It's the whole JSON response. Selection is an array. This comes from React's Lightning design system, and that's how they pass it around. So we just can store it directly. And then this bit for my records, this one's important. We want to store a record instance of every product ID so that we can comment on it. And in order to comment on it, we need to put a reference as an array into Quip's data model. So that's what this my record looks like. It's just a quick implementation of a record object in Quip, and it has a place where you can set the DOM node where commenting can happen, and you see this function that it supports comments. Just by setting it true, now we can render the comments trigger inside of the Live app and get commenting for free. One other feature of Live apps that's pretty excellent is dynamic menus, and let me show you quickly what that means. I'll bounce out so that you actually can see my screen now. What's interesting, this open in Salesforce button here, as well as the fact that sign out and sign in is dynamic, you can do that by passing in commands to Quip's Live Apps API just to render this dynamically. When you do that, we'll render the menu for you so that it looks consistent, but also give you handlers to invoke functions with. So the dynamic menu code in this example looks like this. Probably a little hard to read, but again, it just says, oh, if you're logged in, render the logout button. And if you're logged out, render the login button. And similarly, there's this function to take an instance of the root record, look at the record ID, and make a link to jump into Salesforce. So again, pretty straightforward there. We did it. We walked through a lot of code in a slide deck, and I hope 60% of it is like swimming around in your head. But I'd love to hear questions, tell you more about learning, developing with Quip. These are all the URLs you would need. We have a Quip booth downstairs. I'll be there today. I'd be happy to spend some time with you, help you get started building a live app. We have some URLs, the platform link, the dev documentation. There's a whole set of like getting started that'll walk you through building your first live app and just getting it set up. We have the examples repository there, which has all the code I showed you today, as well as a ton of other examples. Quip Live Apps don't have to be built in React. We just choose to show you examples there because we figure you might know it. But you can build apps in Angular. You can build apps with jQuery. You can build apps with no library. You just have to produce JavaScript and CSS, and that can run in our Live app. And then get in touch. This is a link to contact us and say hi. Thanks. And of course, I have time for Q&A if you have any questions. Yeah?
So is it possible to use pre-built web components?
Yeah, it is possible. The question is it possible to use pre-built Lightning web components? And it is. I've built an app that uses, so like Einstein Analytics has a Lightning out component. And from there, it's really simple. You just need to bootstrap the Aura library, and from there you can call all those functions. One thing you need to do in that case is you have to enable a bit to get access to run eval, because Quip Live Apps block running eval, but it totally works. So if you have one you want to do, I'd be happy to help you make that work. Yeah, it's cool that way. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Can you connect to open endpoints? Is that your question? Yeah, you can connect to any endpoint on the internet. All you have to do is, if you proxy through Quip's OAuth config, you can talk to any endpoint you want. Actually, do you mind using the mic just because I can't hear you? I apologize.
I have a web API deployed in Heroku platform.
Okay, you have a Heroku app.
Yeah.
And you want to talk to it with a live app.
Exactly.
Totally doable. We do it all the time.
So how do I whitelist the API?
Yeah, actually, you remember back in, well, here, let me show you. The simplest way to do it, there's two ways. You can either in the CSP use the connect sources directive and whitelist your domain, or you can go into Quip's, in the auth config here for your live app. Remember I was mentioning there's this proxy API domains. If you put it in here as a domain, and you can use wildcards, now you can use the auth config to proxy requests to the servers that match this API domain's input. So you could do star.heroku.com if you wanted to talk to anything on Heroku, for instance, or you could be more specific and just talk to your own API. Yeah, sure. All right, well, that's a wrap. Thanks.